Hello, everyone. This is Alicia from Dataninja. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar with our guest, Paul Bradshaw, data journalist at the BBC Shared Data Unit and course director for the MA in Data Journalism at Birmingham City University. Paul, thank you for being with us today. Paul will tell us more about using ChatGPT and generative AI in the context of journalism. As a reminder, the webinar is part of the data journalism training program that Dataninja runs together with Generative. If you haven't signed up already, my colleague Francesca has just posted the link in the chat.
Thank you very much. Can you see that? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Slide there. Lovely. So as Ali said, I'm Paul Bradshaw. I lead the MA in Data Journalism at Birmingham City University. I'm going to talk for the next 30 to 40 minutes about various ways that you can use generative AI tools like ChatGPT in your journalism for a range of different ways. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. Another way of phrasing this, as I said recently, is we're really talking about how to work with a bullshitting robot. It's a very good robot. It's very useful in certain circumstances, but we need to remember it's also full of rubbish. And I use the word bullshit quite specifically because there's a guy who wrote a book on bullshit where he defines bullshit quite specifically as lying, something that's different to lying. It's when someone doesn't care whether something is true or false. They only care if it's persuasive. And that's a really accurate description of ChatGPT and similar tools. They're designed to be convincingly conventional. They follow a number of conventions. They follow the patterns of the way that humans write and have written on the web in particular for the last 10 to 20 years. Now, despite this, when you look at kind of how the industry is using ChatGPT and similar tools, the number one way that they have been working with this is around text creation. I actually think, and I'm going to explain over the next half an hour why, I actually think that that's probably one of the least useful applications of ChatGPT. It's the most obvious, it's the easiest way to use it, but actually it's more effective in other areas. For example, workflow efficiency, I think that's where it has some really interesting applications. Text correction, it's a very useful editor. Topic ideation, it's good for helping with idea generation as well. But ultimately, it works best in the middle of the process. So somewhere between you having the idea and you actually publishing and editing the story. In the middle of all of that, there's some interesting stuff. But we must remember it deals in plausibility. It deals in believability. If you ask ChatGPT to generate research by someone called Paul, for example, it might predict that the word Paul might be followed by Bradshaw, and they might have a book that sounds like Data Journalism for Beginners or Data Journalism Handbook. That's not a book I've ever written, but it's plausible. And ChatGPT does make up sources, so you do need to check its sources. One example of this, an experiment with this in Germany, involved using ChatGPT technology to generate fact boxes. It required so much editing that actually it wasn't worth the time. It actually, took as much time as it saved. So, having started with those caveats, those warnings, I still think there are some really useful ways that generative AI can help with journalism, and I absolutely think this is already transforming. It's transforming the way that my students do their work, the way that they learn how to code, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this changes the news industry. And I'm mainly talking about ChatGPT and Google Bard. Google Bard is probably an easier way to use it. You don't need to create a login in the same way that you do with ChatGPT. These are text-based generative AI tools. There are others as well, which I'll mention right at the end, but I'm largely talking about this because really, as journalists, we're mainly dealing with text. And the first application is summaries. And this is quite well known. You know, AI is very good at summarizing information. If you're dealing with long documents, for example, you've got a large report or an application for a license, a local authority, those sorts of things, it's quite good for boiling them down, identifying needles in that haystack. So, for example, you might have a research paper and you want to know, is it worth reading further? Now, when you ask ChatGPT to summarize it, it's useful to prompt it about the audience that you're serving. You can also prompt the ChatGPT to take on a particular role. So you can say, you are a British journalist, summarize this document aimed at writing for a Birmingham, UK audience. There are actually AI-based tools like chatpdf.com that make this even easier. And I think we'll see a number of these emerge over the next 12 months. This is an experiment by a guy called Nicholas Diakopoulos, who has done a lot of research in the area of generative AI. It's well worth looking at his website and looking at generativeAInewsroom.com for some of the things that he's found. One of the experiments that he did was to ask ChatGPT to rate the newsworthiness of research abstracts. So again, kind of summarizing it with a particular purpose in mind. And you'll notice the prompt here at the bottom. You are a prize-winning professional science and technology journalist. You have years of experience, extensive editorial knowledge, and excellent judgment for what makes a compelling news story. Rate the newsworthiness of the following research abstract. Now, that initial bit is really important when dealing with generative AI. You know, helping put the prompt into context will improve the results that you get. And I'm going to come back to prompts as we come through, because really what this is all about is not just using AI, but actually the skill and knowledge to write effective prompts. So summaries are relatively straightforward. I'm going to move on to systems as a second application of AI. As journalists, we're very often dealing with a number of different systems. It might be the education system for one story, the health system for another, the justice system, the political system, sports systems, the fashion industry, whatever it is. AI is really good at helping to explain systems and provide the material for potential story ideas. So I wanted to do a story about school uniforms. Well, that's a subject, but it's not a story. Knowing the rules that have to be followed in a particular field is always a good place to look for story ideas, particularly investigative story ideas. So in this case, a simple question: what rules do schools have to follow? And there are a number of points here about, you know, potential guidelines. Any of these could be the seed of a story idea. What you can also do with AI tools is ask them to generate code that will draw a system diagram. There's a tool called Mermaid, which is used for drawing kind of system diagrams and organization trees. And so you can say to ChatGPT, write code in Mermaid to explain a particular system, or how a patient moves through the health system. And then you just copy and paste that code into Mermaid, and it will draw a diagram of that system as well. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that ChatGPT has got the system up to date or it's 100% correct, but it will give you get you a little bit further in that starting point in terms of, okay, what do I look at next? Which part of this system do I need to look at further? What questions might I ask next? Now, subbing is another obvious application of generative AI, asking it to correct your writing, asking you to pick up mistakes, grammatical mistakes, spelling mistakes, and just generally be punchier or have a particular style. And one really important thing to always do with this is ask it to explain what changes it's made and why. So whereas a spell check will just kind of highlight things, you can actually ask it to enter into a bit more of a dialogue with you. So it's a little bit like having an assistant, a personal tutor that's helping you with your writing. Now, ChatGPT has a tendency to overwrite, and it's not a great journalist in terms of style unless you prompt it. So it's worth giving it a bit of feedback as you go along. So it tends to use long words where a short one will do. Now, in British journalism, for example, that's a big no-no. The general guidance is don't use a 12-letter word if a 4-letter word will do. Don't use 5 words if you can say the same thing in 2 words. And you can tell ChatGPT that. You can say, this is a little bit wordy. Can you keep it simple? Can you write as if you're writing for a 5-year-old? You've started with background. I want you to start with a new thing. That's how you should write as a journalist, those sorts of things. And again, think about audience as well. Tell it what the audience is, tell it what the context is. You can ask it to add suggestions for improvements in the structure of the story, or what elements can be left out as well. You know, how can I chop this back? A Colombian website has tried some of these experiments, and they found that, curiously, sometimes it would say it had corrected a sentence when it hadn't actually made any changes. One thing they definitely found as well is style. So the style isn't necessarily quite the same as the style that your publication might have. But what's really interesting about their findings is this finding about prompts. Creating prompts takes longer than we initially estimated. What you get is only as good as your prompts, and it's not a case of just getting one result. It's that conversation where you say, okay, you've given me your first draft. Now please make these changes. Please factor this extra piece of information in, and so on. And I'll show you an example later which illustrates this quite well. One useful application, if you're live tweeting or you're writing content on one platform that you then need to re-edit for another platform, is to ask ChatGPT to do some of that work for you. So in this example, I've said, you are a journalist who has live tweeted in an event. Now you need to turn the live tweets below into a news story. And this last part is really interesting. I've said, do not add anything that is not in the tweets. So if you don't tell it that, it might add extra information that you didn't actually tweet, and that probably isn't true. So really be careful to guide it and check that it hasn't added anything. But it does a really good job here. It takes a chronological sequence of updates to Twitter. It takes abbreviations and abbreviates them. And it does quite a good job of creating a first draft that you can then start to edit into something publishable. Another thing to mention with ChatGPT is it has a limit on the amount of information you can give it and the amount of information that it can put out. So if you're asking it to write something longer than 500 words, for example, it's not going to be able to do that. What you need to do in that case, again, is split up the task, split up the story into a number of inputs and a number of outputs. And you can even ask ChatGPT to help you with that process. You can say, break down this process into a number of different steps that are going to fit within 500 word chunk or less chunks. Generating alternative titles is another bit of editing that ChatGPT can do quite well. It can optimize titles for search and for social media, not brilliantly, but it can, again, get you moving in that direction. If this is a skill you don't have, it'll be better than nothing. If it's a skill you do have, you'll find that you can optimize it maybe a little bit better, but it can do some good stuff. So that's editing, subbing. If you come on to sources next, ChatGPT is a good way of coming up with ideas for different types of sources for your stories. This is a screenshot from a piece of work by one of my students earlier this year. She was doing a story about carbon emissions in India, and she wanted to come up with some, loosen up her ideas about types of sources. And so ChatGPT suggests climate scientists, NGOs, government officials, relatively straightforward, but a good range of suggestions of types of sources. She asked it where she could get data for abandoned test matches. Now, remember that ChatGPT only has information up until a couple of years ago, unless you've got the pro version. That will change as time goes on, but there's always going to be a time lag between what's published and whether ChatGPT knows about it or not. So again, it's a useful starting point. It's a useful alternative to using Google, or complement, I should say, not an alternative, but something else you can try if you're struggling to find sources. What you've got to remember throughout all of this is not only is ChatGPT a bullshitting robot, it's also a racist, sexist, biased little robot. There's a great story about self-driving cars, and basically, self-driving cars are great. It's like having a 4-year-old who's driving your car. You'd let it take the wheel if it was doing something simple, but as soon as things get complicated, you need to be there to take control of the wheel. And when I read that comparison with self-driving cars, I kind of thought that's a really good analogy. It's like having a small child who can do some stuff, but you shouldn't leave them alone. And in this case, it's like having a racist, sexist 4-year-old child that can help, but you wouldn't leave them on their own. So we did some research at Birmingham City University into the bias in generative AI tools, because what we found was that incredibly, the guidelines that have been produced for using generative AI in the news industry, a lot of them do not actually tackle the bias that is built into the language models that ChatGPT and Bard are based on. So when we asked ChatGPT who the 20 most important actors of the 20th century were, it didn't name a single actor of color. If you ask it about Winston Churchill or the American founding fathers, it leaves out details that might be quite significant and important to those stories. And that's because it's based on a body of work that reflects the society that has access to online publishing, that is able to publish more, and so on. People have done research on the political leanings of different large language models, the models that generative AI tools are based on. And this is a diagram of where different language models sit in terms of those political leanings. So it is biased. We need to factor that into our work. And interestingly, when you look at the industry's concerns about generative AI, it's bothered about quality, it's bothered about accuracy, it's bothered about copyright, but there's no concern about bias there, which really should be very high on the list of priorities of news organizations. So we put together a series of guidelines on using generative AI with these issues in mind. And the first one is to be aware of that built-in bias. The second is to be transparent where it's appropriate to be transparent. So you wouldn't necessarily say, I used a spell checker in the creation of this article, but there'll be other situations where it is appropriate. Building diversity into your prompts, I think, is really interesting. Tools like ChatGPT have the potential to help us recognize our own bias and address our own bias as journalists as well. And we can ask it for more diverse sources, more diverse ideas, things like that. We can ask it to draw on particular types of source material and help us understand the sorts of source material that it's using. And if we do find mistakes and biases, we should be reporting those back into the system that's generated it. And of course, throughout all of this, we need to maintain that journalistic skepticism of treating what we get from generative AI like we would treat any source of information. So I'm going to come back to bias later, but for now, we'll move on to using generative AI to help you with searches, with advanced searches. Henk van Es, the open source investigation expert, has written some really interesting stuff about how you can use ChatGPT to basically create a Google on steroids. So to come up with Google formulas, advanced search phrases that are really quite complex, because when you write a very advanced search, you're essentially coding, you're essentially including operators saying, I only want sites that are in Japan, and I only want PDFs, and I only want documents within this date range. I might want documents in a particular language. That's perfect for ChatGPT's coding ability. And you're already seeing a number of tools pop up which are AI-based and will generate these phrases for you. So Google Word Sniper is one that Henk van Es created. Dork GPT is another one. A Google Dork is basically a search phrase, an advanced search phrase. So that's search. Then we have inspiration. So I've run out of S's now. We've had sources, summaries, subbing, inspiration. And this is where I said I was going to show you an example of how that conversation plays out often with ChatGPT and how important prompt design is. So this was early in my experimentation with ChatGPT. I asked it to generate 10 story ideas about the climate visa, about a particular issue. And ChatGPT doesn't know that I'm a journalist. It doesn't know that it's supposed to be acting journalistically. So when it hears story ideas, it thinks I mean fictional stories. So the ideas it gives me are things like, in the near future, governments worldwide implement a climate visa program. A young couple from a coastal city in the US is forced to make a difficult decision to leave their home. Great for a movie script, rubbish for a journalist. So in my next prompt, I say, sorry, I meant to generate 10 news story ideas about the climate visa. But we hit another problem here. It gives me a series of news story ideas that sound great, like rising sea levels force Pacific Islanders to seek climate visas. But that's not happened. That isn't an event that's happened, because ChatGPT can't tell me, unless I've got pro version, what's happening. It can't tell me what's new. And by definition, if something is a news story, then ChatGPT shouldn't know about it, because if it's already been covered, then it's not news anymore. And that's the only way that ChatGPT would know about it. So news story ideas, like this, very specific news story ideas, it's not going to be able to do. So my next prompt is generate 10 ideas for features, because features are not going to need to be something new happening. It's going to be something that is about a long-running trend or a new insight into an existing issue. And here it does much better. So we've got, we could do a deep dive into the lives of climate visa recipients. We could look for stories of resilience and adaptation. We could look at the challenges of obtaining a climate visa or the countries offering those. This is quite good at kind of loosening up the idea generation process. Francesco Marconi has put together a really useful guide on this process of writing prompts for AI. And that includes some of the things I've mentioned, like specifying the audience that we're going to be generating ideas for or summarizing information for, and so on. Clarifying the type of story, if it's a story that we're asking for. Defining the length of what we want. Setting style rules. You could essentially paste your style guide into your conversation with Bard or ChatGPT and say, here is my style guide. Please use this style guide for all the subsequent responses that you give to me in this conversation. Asking it to explain the output is something else that's mentioned here. Providing context. So you are a journalist, you are an Italian journalist, you are a French journalist, you are a specialist science journalist, you're a good journalist, you're a bad journalist, whatever it is, give them that context of who they are and what they're doing. We've got the advice to make target iterations, so specify the changes that you want to make, and requesting the sources that they're using as well. So these 10 guidelines are a really good starting point for good prompt design. So, more idea generation. What parts of the UK school system might be suitable for a journalistic investigation? It's really good at, again, systems and kind of coming up with potential story ideas. Now, what's quite interesting in terms of guidelines is that the Telegraph, for example, newspaper in the UK, has issued guidelines that essentially say you can't use it to write stories, but to predict story development and lines that might be pursued on a long-running story. That's explicitly identified as an acceptable application. So in this example, I've said, you are a journalist writing for this magazine or this publication. Here's the background. The number of NHS dentists has been declining for many years now. Make a list of potential developments in this issue or future storylines to plan ahead for. Do not write a story. So that sort of prompt is quite useful for thinking about what might happen next in a particular issue. And then you can follow it up and say, okay, idea number 6, give me a plan for how I might report that. What types of, sources might I go to? That sort of thing. And there's some more examples here in terms of generating ideas for interview approaches. So writing a professional email to an expert, asking them if they would agree to be interviewed, or a charity, or a person who's had an experience of something. This can be quite good in giving you ideas about your own kind of professional approach to someone. The results I found are actually quite often more empathetic. They are probably a bit more interested in the person than a lot of emails that journalists write. So well worth experimenting with to kind of freshen up your own emails if they've become quite utilitarian, shall we say, a little bit basic. Then we've got perspective. And this is where we come back to the bias. One of the most interesting applications I've seen of generative AI in journalism is to ask it to identify potential bias or highlight elements of a story that might be interpreted in different ways by different audiences. So you can see in the top right example, they've pasted a story about abortion, and they've asked ChatGPT, how would this news story be received by people on opposite sides of the issue? Would it feel fair is another question that they asked. And you can see the response in the bottom right says, it's picked out potentially sensationalist language or biased language like looming hazard. This is in a different story as well, about a forest fire. On the left, you can see about abortion. So this might be seen as fair by some people. There are some particular parts of the story that some particular wording that might be a little bit problematic. So a really interesting experiment with using this as a mirror to look at your work from a different perspective. And then we've got some other stuff that ChatGPT is quite good at. And coding, I think, is really exciting in terms of how it can help accelerate your development if you're interested in coding as a journalist. I introduced ChatGPT into my teaching last semester, and I reckon probably 20% of the students who wouldn't have coded ended up coding because they had this support that they could draw on, and those who would have coded anyway did much more advanced coding because they were able to learn more quickly. It's really useful for helping you identify problems in your code. It's useful for generating initial code that you can then customize and adapt. And that's a really good way to learn how to code. So that last example was a scraper that grabs particular information from a URL. You need to give it the URL. Remember that ChatGPT cannot see websites, it cannot visit websites. So you need to describe the particular web address or the particular HTML tags that you want to target, things like that. The more information you give it, the better. Same sort of prompt with R. Specifying the library or the package that you want to use will help as well. You can see this query is quite specific about what I'm asking it to grab. So links that start with a particular pattern of characters followed by one or more of any alphanumeric characters. So you're having to kind of think like a computer. This is one I did quite recently for some charts in R. And if you paste the start of the data frame or table, then it knows the structure, it knows what the field names are called, so that makes it easy for it to generate the code that's going to draw the chart that you want. Troubleshooting, I mentioned before. This was quite an interesting example where I was writing some code to build a website of lots of pages about different rows of data. And the website was working, but this drop-down menu wouldn't work. And so I asked ChatGPT. Now, it didn't fix the problem, but it did direct my attention to, it kind of just helped me look at it from a different perspective, and it helped me work out what the problem was. So even when it doesn't fix the problem, it can just help you get closer to an answer. So what we're talking about here is a series of language models, ChatGPT, Bard, and similar tools. They're all about predicting the next word. And that's really good for coding, because coding is not about what's factual or what's right or what's wrong. It's just about something that's functional. And so it's very good for coding, not so good at facts. It doesn't even know if one number is bigger than another number, for example, sometimes. So we're going to have some questions in a minute. I'm going to make some final points as well, but just to run through all those S's that I've just gone through. For summaries, if you're coming across large documents that you wouldn't otherwise be able to go through, this can open up those resources as possible news sources, because it can get through them quicker than you might have time to. Systems, it can help you understand how those work. It can certainly help you write for different audiences and spot weaknesses in your writing. It can help you think of different sources. It can help you do advanced searches, and it can give you different perspectives and different ideas around different stories. And perhaps the most useful use of it, if you code, is coding and programming. I said I'd come back to the other tools as well. ChatGPT and Google Bard are just two of many generative AI tools, and new ones are being added every day. obviously there are tools for generative images. So and it's been really odd recently to see that I think it's Associated Press are using ChatGPT to, or not ChatGPT, sorry, are using generative AI for photos of conflict, which I don't understand why that would be a use of it, but for illustration, the more abstract imagery, it can be really interesting, where you're not trying to pretend that something is real. It's just, you know, like this is like an idea of what it looks like inside a head or something like that. I saw this lovely idea a couple of days ago, someone talking about nuclear power, and they've used generative AI to generate a series of images where someone gets more and more amazed at this series of facts. It's a really creative use of those tools. So not for factual imagery, for kind of illustration type stuff. It's quite interesting. There are all sorts of copyright issues here, which we can talk about in the questions, but that's worth highlighting as well. Text to video, text to images, those tools, generative video tools, tools that will edit video that already exists. And one interesting application of this I've seen is by David Dunkley-Guillemard, who used it to take archive material about his father and turn it into a video, which would normally be quite tricky to do. So that's a really interesting experiment as well with generative video. So those are some of the other tools. And a final note is that if you think you're not going to use AI, it'd be odd to just spend the last 45 minutes listening to me about it, but you're already using it. And the really weird and quite concerning aspect of this is that we're now seeing results like these creep into Google search and Bing search, where you've got questions like, does Australia exist, being answered no, because there's a conspiracy theory about the existence of Australia, which has populated the web and is being treated as knowledge by Bing's AI driven algorithms. Likewise, there's this weird one about countries that start with a K in Africa. None of them begin with the letter K, according to Google, because of text that's out there on the web. So instead of, because these search engines now are trying to answer your question without you going to a website, they're presenting mythical information as answers to questions. So, as I said, don't think learning how to use AI, think about learning how to write effective prompts. It's not as simple as you might think. It can help you in all sorts of ways, but at the end of the day, you're the person that has to check that things are factual. You're the person that has to do the final edit. You're the one that has to kind of work out how to turn something into a story. And remember that, you know, for all the criticism of ChatGPT being biased, so are you. So it's a very useful way of checking your own biases. So, any questions? And there's some useful resources there as we pick up the questions as well.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was really inspiring and a lot of information, like condensed very effectively. So thank you very much. I see we have 2 questions in the chat. I'm going to read them. We have about 10 minutes to keep answering them. So if you have any more, keep writing. So the first question is from Omer, who mentioned the fact that ChatGPT-4 is pretty good with browsing the web, so even without the need of plugins. Have you tried it, and how can browsing expand its future usage?
Yeah, I think that's the paid version, isn't it? The kind of pro version of chat. You can use, if you like, live-ish results, so it can draw on information more up to date. That's more up to date. I think so. There's been some interesting kind of experiments with it. It seems to pick up some information but not other information, so it's not always entirely up to date. I think the other big issue is that so many news organizations, among others, have now blocked ChatGPT. So anything to do with kind of up-to-date developments, to an extent, ChatGPT's knowledge of news beyond the middle of this year is going to be partial anyway, because it will not have been able to access quite a wide range of news websites. So there's a number of kind of issues to consider there in terms of its access to more up-to-date information. I think generally, as I said, it's how recent and how widespread its knowledge is secondary to the fact that you need to treat it skeptically regardless. And you're unlikely to know all the sources that it has anyway. So I think just the general principle is, don't trust it to know everything. Don't trust it to know to get everything right, but it can save you some of the work of finding out. In a similar way, you can compare this to when Google started to become widely used, or Wikipedia. The general advice would be, well, Google can help you find a website, but you still need to go and check that website and check if it's factual. Wikipedia can give you a summary of an issue, but use the references, use the footnotes to go and verify that further.
Thank you. Then we have two questions which I think can go together, because Sammy asked what is the AI tool that's being shown, and then Anna asked if there's going to be a place where we can find all the links. And I don't know if, Paul, you plan on publishing the slides somewhere, or they're already published and people can find them?
Yeah, I can put them in the chat. You can see the generative video tools shown here are runwayml.com and ModelScope. But there are just so many generative video tools. I would just Google generative video or look for resources about the best generative video tools. Like the links at the end, I'll try and put them in the chat. I think most of them you can kind of Google. Let's see if I can. Oh yeah, I can put these in the chat. Or can I?
Well, otherwise, this talk is going to be put on YouTube, so you can watch it also again, and maybe take a screenshot of the slide and find the links as well.
I'm just going to put these as an answer to Anna's question in the. Oh, actually, no, that's not. It's not worked as I thought it would be. There we go. I'll start putting them in the chat as we answer some of the questions as well. Yeah.
Then we have another last question, two other actually. Where is so how about citing the use of AI in your work? So whether you're a journalist or you work in academia or you're a student, how do you cite ChatGPT? And why?
I think that's a really tricky one, because there's so many different ways that you might use AI. So that the amount of ways you might attribute them is similarly very, very diverse. The examples that I've seen the Daily Mirror have at the end of a story just saying part of this story was generated through AI or something like that. The first thing would be to find out within your organization what the policy is about attributing the use of it. That should be part of the AI policy as a whole. If there isn't one, then you can even suggest one, or you can ask for one to be generated. I would I think at the end of the article, in most cases, as a kind of a footnote, you might say something like, generative AI was used in a generation of ideas for this, or it was used to suggest potential sources. You could link to a separate page if you want to have a full methodology, for example. So there's quite quite a few ways of doing it, but it's difficult to give a single way of doing it. Yeah, I think I've got all those links in there. Probably missed one out. That's the document. Yeah, so I think all the links are in the chat.
Yeah, I think so too. Thanks. Okay, then, well, we have a final question, which is about they hope to get a copy of the presentation. But I mean, even if you don't have the slides, we will upload this presentation on YouTube. And because you have signed up to the webinar, you will receive a link to view the presentation as well. So you can view it anytime. Okay. Then I see one last question in the chat from Federico, which is, do you see and foresee a change in how journalism is taught since generative AI tools are available? In other words, are they just a resource at the disposal of journalists, or do you think they will change journalism? And I think this is the last question we can take for today.
Could you go through that again? Sorry, I can't see it on the chat.
So it asks.
Oh, no, that's okay. I can see it now. Sorry. Do I see a change in how journalism is taught? Oh, wow, yes. I think, I mean, already within education generally, I think the university system, and we're not even getting to schools yet, but in universities, I think there's a rapid move to adjust to what this means for education generally, and that has a number of aspects to it. You've obviously got the kind of plagiarism aspect of how we prevent students using it for plagiarism, but then you've also got how is it being used in industry, and how do we reflect that in the teaching? How do we change assessment so it's AI proof? I think that's a massive shift. I think any assessment that asks people to summarize things is just not viable anymore. I think there'll be a lot of assessment where we have to just say, we actually instruct people to use AI and then show how they've edited it, how they've prompted it. So part of the assessment will be about prompt design. Part of it will be about editing skills. And I think the really interesting development for me is that for all the time I've been teaching journalism and when I was a student, I'd say 90% of journalism teaching has been about how to write, the technical challenge of how to write. And yet when we talk about journalism, 90% of what we talk about is the news gathering, is getting hold of exclusives, is getting an interviewee. And that's what makes the really important journalism. And yet that is actually only a small part of teaching, because the biggest hurdle is the technical challenge of being able to tell a story well. You need to master that before you can before you can focus on getting the story. And I see a lot of really good journalists who can get great stories, but can't tell those stories, and they don't get into the industry. And they should, because really they're better journalists. They're just not very good storytellers. So I think we're going to see a shift away from storytelling and towards news gathering and editing. So partly because ChatGPT type tools can do a lot of summarization and curation and that sort of thing. So we need primary news gathering, that to be distinctive. And we're going to need the editorial skills to fact check what AI tools spit out. So an AI can do a lot of the work of making our information meaningful, make it into a story. So yeah, I think that's going to be a big shift. I think there's going to be more teaching of how to write prompts and more teaching of how to edit. And we're going to have to be able to think logically in that sense as well. Yeah. Sorry, that was quite a long answer there.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for being our guest today. Thank you all for attending this webinar. I have a final remark. So as I said in the beginning, this webinar is part of the data journalism training program by ADGenet and Dataninja. You can still sign up for the program, even if we are going to close the applications to join the program in a few weeks. So make sure you join as soon as possible. And in February, there's going to be a first closing ceremony for the program, which will run through July, but we'll have a first step in February, where the participants and students who have completed their project will be able to showcase it to a public, wider audience. So yes, please sign up to the program if you haven't done so already. And if you are signed up, remember this deadline of the February ceremony. And thank you all for being here today. And enjoy the rest of the weekend almost, actually. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.